Quentin Lawson leaned back in his office chair, staring at the latest customer satisfaction reports with a deep frown. Complaints had been rising at a specific location store 9 of his 12-store chain. The issues ranged from rude employees to long wait times, but what bothered him most were the ones about staff being mistreated by management. He had built this company from the ground up after buying it from its previous owner years ago. He prided himself on fostering a positive work environment, but if these reports were true, something was seriously wrong. He had tried addressing the problem through upper management, but every time he questioned the district manager, he got the same answer. It's nothing serious, just employees exaggerating. Quentin wasn't convinced. He needed to see it for himself. That's how he found himself in front of store 9, dressed in a worn-out hoodie and faded jeans, his normally well-groomed hair covered under a cheap baseball cap. He hadn't personally met most of the employees in his stores. His company had grown too large for that, so no one would recognize him. He applied online under a fake name and was hired as a trainee. Today was his first shift. The moment he stepped inside, he sensed the tension in the air. Employees moved quickly, avoiding eye contact with a short, stocky man barking orders near the front counter. Quentin recognized him from a company photo. Dale, the store manager. "You, new guy," Dale snapped, pointing at Quentin. "Get back there and start prepping orders, and don't stand around like an idiot." Quentin nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He had dealt with tough bosses before, but something about Dale's tone was off. He wasn't just firm, he was aggressive. He made his way to the back, where a few employees were assembling food for the steady line of customers. A young woman, about 6 or 7 months pregnant, was carefully placing food into a bag. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead as she moved slowly but deliberately. "Come on, Lee, move faster," Dale's voice thundered from behind them. Lee flinched but kept working. "I'm trying," she said softly. "Try harder," Dale snapped. "Pregnant or not, you're working this shift like everyone else. If you can't keep up, maybe you shouldn't be here." Quentin felt his hands clench into fists. He had expected to find problems, but this? A manager berating a pregnant employee in front of everyone. Lee swallowed hard and nodded, not arguing back. Quentin noticed the other employees keeping their heads down, pretending not to hear. No one dared to speak up. Dale turned his glare toward Quentin. What's your name again?" Quinn," Quentin lied. "Well, Quinn, don't just stand there. Follow her lead and try not to be as slow as she is," Dale sneered before stomping off toward the front. Quentin exhaled, trying to keep his anger in check. He turned to Lee. "You okay?" She gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Yeah. I'm used to it." That made it worse. She shouldn't have to be used to this. For the next few hours, Quentin observed everything. Dale constantly hovered, barking insults instead of instructions. Employees worked in fear, rushing to avoid his wrath. Lee never got a break, even when she leaned against the counter, obviously exhausted. By the end of the shift, Quentin had seen enough. He wouldn't let this continue, but before he confronted Dale, he needed to see how deep the problem ran. Tomorrow, he would push Dale's buttons. And if things got worse, he would make sure everyone knew exactly who he was. The next morning, Quentin arrived early, blending in with the other employees as they clocked in. The air inside the store was thick with unspoken tension. Workers moved with mechanical precision, their eyes constantly darting toward the doors, anticipating Dale's arrival. Quentin positioned himself near the prep station, pretending to focus on assembling orders while observing everything around him. Lee was already there, her movements slower than yesterday, her shoulders hunched with exhaustion. A few of the younger employees whispered among themselves, casting wary glances toward the front. Then Dale stormed in. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't check in. He just went straight to criticizing. "Why is this station such a mess?" he barked, slamming his palm against the counter. The sound made one of the newer workers flinch. "You all get lazier every day." Quentin forced himself to remain neutral. He needed to push Dale further to see how bad things really were. As the morning rush began, he deliberately slowed down while bagging an order, not enough to cause a disruption, but just enough to be noticeable. Dale caught on immediately. "Are you serious, Quinn?" Dale snapped, stepping up behind him. "It's bad enough I have to deal with people who can't keep up. Now I've got you dragging things down too. Quentin turned slightly, pretending to fumble with a wrapper. I'm just making sure everything's right. Dale narrowed his eyes. No one cares about perfect, they care about fast. If you can't do both, you're useless. Quentin glanced at Lee. She kept her head down, folding a bag with shaking hands. Dale wasn't just bad at managing, he was poisoning the work environment. The next few hours were a blur of stress and exhaustion. Dale never let up. He snapped at the cashier for taking too long with a customer's change. He berated a cook for not having fresh fries ready fast enough. He even went as far as pulling an employee aside and threatening to cut their hours if they didn't pick up the pace. Quentin clenched his jaw. He had seen enough. Then the breaking point came. Lee paused to lean against the counter, taking a slow breath. She was struggling to stay upright. Dale noticed. You better not need another break, he said sharply. You already got to sit down once today. You think the rest of us get to slack off? Lee's hands tightened into fists. I just need a minute, Dale scoffed. A minute you're getting paid for. You either work or go home. Your choice. Quentin's vision darkened with anger enough. He stepped forward, keeping his voice level but firm. She's pregnant. She's not slacking off. She's exhausted. Dale turned on him instantly. And who asked you? You've been here, what a day. Don't tell me how to run my store. Quentin took a deep breath, then exhaled. The moment had come. He straightened his posture, his entire demeanor shifting. The timid, unsure trainee was gone. You're not running anything, he said, his voice carrying weight. I am. Silence fell over the kitchen. Employees stopped moving. Even the customers at the counter sensed something had changed. Dale blinked. What? Quentin pulled off his cap, revealing his real identity. My name is Quentin Lawson. I own this company. Dale's face drained of color. The employees stared, wide-eyed. Lee's lips parted slightly, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. You've spent the last 2 days proving exactly why this store is failing, Quentin continued. Mistreating employees, ignoring their needs. Running this place with fear instead of leadership. Dale opened his mouth, but no words came out. Quentin turned to the staff. None of you deserve to work in a place where you're afraid of your own boss. A ripple of emotions spread through the group: shock, relief, disbelief. Quentin shifted his gaze back to Dale. You're done here. Dale's mouth finally caught up with his brain. You can't. I can, Quentin interrupted. And I just did. Dale looked around, searching for support, but none of the employees moved. The power he had over them was gone. Leave, Quentin said. Dale hesitated, then, realizing there was no way out, stormed toward the exit. He shoved open the door, disappearing into the parking lot without another word. Quentin turned back to the stunned employees. A long silence stretched between them. Then Lee let out a shaky breath, and the weight over Store 9 finally lifted. A heavy silence hung in the air. The employees stood frozen, their eyes darting between each other and the door Dale had just stormed through. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the weight of months, maybe even years, of mistreatment had finally been lifted, but no one knew what to do now that it was gone. Quentin scanned the faces in front of him. Some looked relieved, others hesitant. Lee, still bracing herself against the counter, seemed almost afraid to believe what had just happened. He knew this wasn't over. Firing Dale was only the first step. He took a deep breath, shifting his attention to the employees. They needed to hear what came next. He assured them that no one was going to lose their jobs because of what had just happened. If anything, things were about to change for the better. He explained that he had come undercover because of the rising complaints and wanted to see firsthand what was going wrong. What he found: the mistreatment, the fear, the toxic atmosphere was unacceptable and wouldn't be tolerated any longer. The employees listened, their expressions a mixture of cautious hope and disbelief. One of the younger workers, a cashier who had barely spoken all shift, hesitated before speaking. She admitted that many of them had wanted to quit but stayed because they had no better options. Dale had made them feel replaceable, like they weren't worth more than their next paycheck. Quentin nodded. That was exactly the kind of culture he had worked so hard to prevent, yet somehow it had taken root here. It was his responsibility to fix it. He turned to Lee. She looked exhausted, worn down not just from the physical strain but from months of enduring someone like Dale breathing down her neck. He asked if she was all right, if she needed to sit down. She hesitated, then finally admitted she was exhausted. That was all Quentin needed to hear. He told her to take the rest of the day off with full pay. At first, she resisted, insisting she didn't want special treatment, but he made it clear this wasn't special treatment. This was basic decency. One of the cooks, a man who had been working quietly in the back, finally spoke up. He asked what would happen next. Who would be in charge? Would things actually change, or would another manager come in and do the same thing? Quentin understood the concern. He told them the store would have an interim manager, someone from another location with a strong track record of treating employees well. But long-term, they would have a say in who replaced Dale. He wanted their input on what kind of leadership they needed. It was clear they weren't used to having a voice. Some of them looked skeptical, others hopeful. But at least now they knew he was listening. He also made it clear that their working conditions were going to improve. No more skipped breaks, no more threats. No more treating people like they were disposable. A shift supervisor, someone who had been under Dale's command but didn't seem to share his cruel streak, admitted that he had been afraid to speak up before. Dale had a way of making people feel like they had no power, even those in leadership positions. Quentin appreciated the honesty. He told them that fear-based management wasn't leadership, it was control, and it had no place in his company. He could see the shift happening in real time. The employees, once stiff with tension, started to relax. Some even exchanged glances as if realizing for the first time that they weren't alone in what they had been feeling. But Quentin knew words weren't enough. They had to see real changes, and they had to see them now. He asked what they needed, what would make their jobs better, what would make them feel valued. At first, they hesitated, as if they weren't sure if they were really allowed to ask for anything. Then Lee, still leaning against the counter, finally spoke up. She said they needed more staff. The store was constantly short-handed, which made the job even harder. She wasn't the only one struggling, everyone was overworked. Quentin nodded. That was something he could fix immediately. He promised to authorize new hires within the week. Another worker mentioned that their schedules were constantly being changed at the last minute, making it impossible to plan anything outside of work. That was another easy fix. He assured them that scheduling would be handled more fairly moving forward. A few others chimed in, mentioning broken equipment that never got replaced, supply shortages that made their jobs harder, and the lack of proper training for new hires. Quentin took note of everything. These were basic issues, things that should have been handled long before they became problems. It was clear Dale had been cutting corners wherever he could, and the employees had been paying the price. He wasn't going to let that continue. By the time their shift ended, the atmosphere in the store had changed. There was still uncertainty, but there was also something new hope. As the employees started heading home, Lee lingered for a moment. She looked at Quentin, searching his face for something. Then, softly, she thanked him. Not just for firing Dale, but for actually listening. Quentin nodded. He told her he should have been paying attention sooner. That was on him. But from now on, things would be different. As he watched her walk out the door, he made himself a promise. This wasn't just about Store 9. If this had been happening here, there was no telling what else might be slipping through the cracks in his company. He wasn't going to sit in his office and assume things were running smoothly anymore. He was going to make sure every employee in every store knew they mattered. And he was going to start today. The next morning, Quentin arrived at Store 9 before opening hours. He had barely slept. His mind had been racing with everything he had seen, every failure in leadership that had allowed Dale's behavior to go unchecked. Now that the shock of his reveal had settled, it was time to turn promises into action. The staff trickled in one by one, their steps slower than usual. They weren't sure what to expect. The oppressive presence of Dale was gone, but uncertainty still loomed. Quentin could see it in the way they avoided looking directly at him, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. He wasn't going to waste time. He gathered the employees near the prep station, making sure everyone was present. They stood in a loose circle, arms crossed, some still skeptical that things would actually change. He started by acknowledging what they had been through. He didn't sugarcoat it. Leadership had failed them, and that was on him. He admitted that he had been too far removed from day-to-day operations, trusting reports instead of seeing things for himself. That was going to change. One of the employees, a cook with grease-stained sleeves and tired eyes, finally spoke. He asked what was really going to be different this time. They had heard promises before. They had been told things would improve, yet nothing ever did. Quentin understood the doubt. Words meant nothing without action. He laid out concrete steps. The hiring process had already begun, with additional staff being brought in to ease the workload. A new scheduling system was being implemented to prevent last-minute changes that threw employees' lives into chaos. Equipment repairs had been approved, and replacement orders for missing supplies had been expedited. Then, he addressed leadership. A new store manager would be selected, but this time, employees would have a say. They would be involved in the hiring process, ensuring that whoever took the position actually respected the people working under them. That caught their attention. Some exchanged glances, a flicker of interest breaking through their guarded expressions. Quentin wasn't finished. He had one more step to ensure this never happened again. Store 9 wasn't the only location in his company. If these conditions had been allowed to fester here, there was no telling what might be happening elsewhere. He announced that he would be conducting surprise visits across all stores, speaking directly to employees, ensuring that no one else was suffering under toxic management. That was when the shift happened. Lee, standing near the back, finally looked him in the eye. She had been quiet since arriving, still processing everything. Now, though, there was something different in her expression. A cautious belief that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just talk. Others started to nod. The cook who had spoken earlier crossed his arms but gave a slow, approving grunt. The cashier, who had been afraid to speak up before, let out a small breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Quentin wasn't expecting instant trust. That would take time. But for the first time since he had stepped into this store, he could see the beginnings of something better. He wrapped up the meeting by making one final thing clear. If anyone ever felt mistreated again, if they ever saw leadership abusing their position, they had a direct line to him. No more layers of management filtering complaints, no more ignored reports. When the store opened for the day, the difference was noticeable. The employees were still adjusting, still cautious, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no longer a constant undercurrent of fear. Conversations were a little less strained. Movements were a little less rushed. Lee took her first break without being told no. The cashier handled a difficult customer without the fear of Dale hovering nearby, waiting to criticize. Even the cook, who had spoken so bluntly earlier, seemed to work with a bit more ease, no longer looking over his shoulder. Quentin stayed the entire day, working alongside them, reinforcing that he wasn't just here to observe. He bagged orders, wiped down counters, and ran food to customers. He listened when employees pointed out small inefficiencies and made notes on what could be streamlined. By closing time, exhaustion settled over him, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than before. This wasn't frustration. This was work that mattered. Before leaving, he checked in with Lee one last time. She was tired, but this time, it wasn't from relentless stress. She admitted she hadn't expected things to change so quickly. She had considered quitting, assuming this job would always be the same no matter who was in charge. Now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Quentin nodded. That was all he needed to hear. As he stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin, he made a silent commitment to himself. This wasn't just about Store 9 anymore. This was about making sure he never lost sight of his company again. The next morning, Quentin arrived at Store 9 before the first shift began. He had already made calls overnight to begin implementing the changes he promised, but there was still work to be done. As employees trickled in, he noticed something different. They were still cautious, still unsure of how much had actually changed, but there was less tension in their movements. They weren't rushing to avoid being noticed. He stepped into the back office, the same space where Dale had likely sat for years, making decisions that hurt the people who worked for him. The desk was cluttered with old paperwork, half-filled inventory sheets, and a drawer stuffed with ignored maintenance requests. Quentin flipped through them, shaking his head. Broken equipment had been reported months ago and never addressed. The interim manager was set to arrive later in the day, someone from another store who had a reputation for treating employees well. But Quentin didn't just want to hand things off and walk away. He needed to make sure the transition was handled properly. As the morning rush began, he stayed on the floor, stepping in where needed. He worked alongside the employees, helping bag orders and restock supplies. He kept listening, paying attention to the small details that leadership often overlooked. One of the younger employees hesitated before asking if raises were going to be considered. Quentin appreciated the directness. He explained that wages across the company were already under review, but he would personally push for Store 9 to get priority consideration. Hard work needed to be recognized, and it was clear that for too long, these employees had been undervalued. Throughout the shift, he noticed employees moving with more confidence. They weren't looking over their shoulders anymore. The cashier, who had struggled under Dale's constant criticism, seemed more at ease, handling orders without the fear of being reprimanded. Lee arrived later in the day. She looked better rested, though she still moved carefully, her body adjusting to the physical demands of pregnancy. Quentin made a point to check in with her, asking if she had any concerns about scheduling or accommodations. She admitted that she had worried about losing hours, but was relieved to hear that no one would be penalized for needing reasonable adjustments. While they spoke, another employee approached, asking if the store would be getting more training for new hires. It was a valid concern. Without proper training, employees were set up to struggle from the start. Quentin assured them that a new system was being put in place to ensure every new hire received thorough onboarding. Midway through the afternoon, the interim manager arrived. A woman named Carla. She had been running another location successfully for years. Quentin had chosen her because employees at her store spoke highly of her leadership. He introduced her to the team, explaining that she would be there to stabilize things until a permanent hire was made. Carla wasted no time. She asked employees what they needed to feel supported, listening intently and taking notes. Quentin watched as the staff began to engage more, offering suggestions they never would have voiced under Dale's rule. By the time the evening shift rolled around, the store already felt different. Employees were talking more, exchanging ideas, working together rather than just moving through tasks out of obligation. Before leaving, Quentin gathered the employees one last time. He reiterated that this wasn't just about fixing one store, this was about making sure no location in his company ever suffered under poor leadership again. He told them that his visits weren't over, and that he would be checking in regularly. As he walked to his car, he reflected on everything that had happened. This experience had opened his eyes to just how easily a company's culture could slip when leadership became disconnected. It wasn't enough to implement policies from a distance. He had to be involved, present, and accountable. This wasn't just about Store 9 anymore. It was about ensuring every employee in his company knew they were valued, and he wasn't going to let that slip away again.